In this class, we're going to continue our study of Lesson 2 in Modern Biology. I think this is our third class in Lesson 2. I'm not sure about that. I think it's our third class. We've been studying this second chapter, which actually teaches us about some basic ideas in chemistry and physics. Because these basic ideas in chemistry and physics will help us to study modern biology. So there's 3 subjects in modern high school science: biology, chemistry, and physics. But what we've said a couple times is that they all help each other. So if you haven't had a chance to study chemistry or physics yet, it's helpful to learn some basics before you get started in biology, because they'll be helpful. And your study in biology will also help you to understand chemistry and physics. So we've spent at least 2 class periods going through this chapter. We've learned about some basic ideas in chemistry. The most important idea was that chemists teach that nature is composed of chemical compounds. And these chemical compounds can be broken down, maybe not realistically broken down, but theoretically broken down into what are called chemical elements, which are the simplest chemical building blocks in natural things. And while most chemicals have nothing to do with living things, there are a few that actually are very important in understanding how animals and plants live and grow and what happens when they die. And this chapter has taken us through a simple study of those basic elements. We talked about oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen in this lesson. What we're going to do in this class is finish Lesson 2. The last important topic we have to study about is foods. We got started talking about chemicals in organic things. If you go to college, you might take a class called organic chemistry, which means the chemistry of living things. But we've covered everything in the chapter except for this last portion, and where we're going to begin in this class is at the bottom of page 32 in our document. You see the section titled Classification of Living Matter. Classification of living matter. So to get started, let's get our notes ready. Put your name and date at the top of the page. This is Modern Biology. Modern Biology. And this remains Lesson 2. And I'm just going to write chemistry and physics up here. Introductory experiments in chemistry and physics. And as I said, this is our third class, I believe, going through this chapter. And we're going to try to wrap it up in this class. We're going to start the lesson down on the bottom of page 32 in the document. That's not 32 on the page in the book. That's page 32 in this document that we use in the academy to study. So let's turn to page 32 in the document. Make sure you're there, and down to the bottom to the classification of organic matter. So let's read together. The organic or living part of a plant or animal, the organic or living part of a plant or animal is made up largely of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So make sure you jot this down and keep this in mind. The organic parts of plants and animals are made up mainly of 4 chemical elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The organic parts of plants and animals are composed of 4 elements. C for carbon, H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, and N for nitrogen. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. We talked about that at the end of our last class. So this is review so far. The organic or living part of a plant or animal is made up largely of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, with a very minute amount of several other elements, which collectively we call mineral matters. So remember, minerals make up a very small amount of the parts of living things. The main elements that the bodies and living parts of plants and animals are composed of are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So you can see that, as I said, chemists may say that there are over 100 different elements, but you can see there are a small number of elements that if you could master the knowledge of those elements, that would be most useful. Okay, so even though there may be 100 or 120 or however many there are now, elements identified by chemists, when we talk about real life, the number of elements that actually affects us is very, very few in number. The most important for the study of biology or living things is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. If we were to separate a plant or animal chemically into various compounds, we should find it composed of various groups of tissues, the chemical compositions of which are more or less alike. So if we were to break down the bodies, break down the parts of plants and animals, we would find that they have a lot of things in common. Let's pay attention and take notes. Put that away and let's pay attention. If we compare plants and animals, we find that they actually have a lot in common as far as their chemistry is concerned. After all, there's only so many sources of material for things to be made of. It's the materials that exist on Earth. But they have a lot in common. For example, the living part of a plant corresponds chemically with the living part of an animal. The starch that's found in grains or roots of plants has nearly the same chemical formula as the animal starch found in the liver of man. The starches of plants and animals are the same or nearly the same. The oils of a nut or a fruit are closely allied to the fat in the body of a man or in a sheep or a cow. The oils of fruits and nuts, the oils are like the fats of animals. These building materials of a plant or animal may be placed in one of 3 following groups of organic substances. So we're learning in this lesson 3 groups. This is definitely note material. 3 groups of organic substances. Three groups of organic substances. And this may look familiar because we went over this quickly at the end of our last class. So let's just be a little more careful when we study it this time. 3 groups of organic substances. The first is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. And we've heard of these because we hear about them when we talk about food or exercising and nutrition. Carbohydrates. That's the first group of organic substances. These are groups of organic substances. substances that are found in living things. Substances out of which living things are made. The first group, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are materials containing a certain proportion of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Carbohydrates are materials containing a certain proportion of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we'll just write C, H, and O. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Carbohydrates. The second group of organic substances are fats and oils, which contain chiefly hydrogen and carbon. So the second group is fats and oils, which contain chiefly hydrogen and carbon. And the third group of organic substances are called nitrogenous or proteid. We're going to use the word protein. Nitrogenous or protein substances which contain nitrogen in addition to the above mentioned elements. So the third will be proteins. And notice that it says they contain the other substances, but the main elements in these different substances are these. Carbohydrates consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if you look at the name, look, carbo, where do you think that word comes from? It's because they contain carbon, right? Hydrates, you can see it has to do with the elements that it's composed of, okay? And as for fats and oils and proteins, we could find more technical chemical names for these things. Like the book tells us, proteins can be referred to as nitrogenous substances, and they are primarily composed of nitrogen, right? So three groups of organic substances. Three groups of organic substances. Carbohydrates, composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Fats and oils, composed primarily of hydrogen and carbon. And proteins, which are primarily composed of nitrogen. All right? Nitrogenous substances. These are the three basic groups of organic substances. All right? Let's keep moving on in our chapter. Now, what's important about organic substances is that not only are we made up of organic substances, not only are plants made up of organic substances, not only are all animals made up of organic substances, but these other organic substances, these other plants and animals, they're our food. We eat these things, and that's how we live. We eat the plants. We take the plants that are made up of these substances and we put them into our mouth, chew them up, swallow them, and our body uses those materials to live, to cause our bodies to grow and heal. So these things are our foods. This is how our body actually lives and gets its nourishment. So these organic substances, these are very important to us to understand because these are our foods. This is how we live. We have to understand these things. So the next section in our textbook is titled Foods. And the first question is, what is a food? What is a food? Now, that doesn't just mean something you eat, because you might eat things that are terrible. You might eat things that you shouldn't eat, and they shouldn't be called foods. But when we learn how our bodies actually work and we learn what foods actually are, it should make us think not just what is food, but what should our food be. Okay? What should our food be? Especially if you want to exercise, you want to lift weights, you want to be strong and healthy and active. To do all those things, you have to take care of your body, and a large part of taking care of your body is making sure you eat foods that actually help your body, that nourish your body. So let's read this section on foods. What is a food? We know that if we eat a certain amount of proper foods at regular times, we shall go on doing a certain amount of work, both manual work, physical work, and mental work or intellectual work. If we eat a certain amount of proper foods, not just any foods, a certain amount, not any amount, a certain amount of proper foods at regular times, not any time, okay? So notice it said a certain amount of certain foods at certain times, we shall go on doing a certain amount of work, both manual and mental. We know too that day by day, if our general health is good, we are adding weight to our body, and that added weight comes as a result of taking food into the body. What is true of a boy or a girl is equally true of plants. Plants work in the same way. We have to take something in order to grow. We have to take something in order to have energy to work. So if we don't eat properly, if we don't eat the right kinds of foods at the right times in the right amounts, we're not going to be able to grow and work as we need to. If food is supplied in proper quantity and proportion, plants will live and grow. If the food supply is cut off or even greatly reduced, they will suffer and may die. From this, the definition which follows is evident. So here we have our definition of food. Let's get this down in our notes. Ready? A food is a substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of a plant or animal, or that furnishes energy for it. So that's quite a definition. I'll repeat it one more time and then we'll put it up on the board. A food is a substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of a plant or animal, or that furnishes energy for it. That's the definition of a food. So if you eat something that doesn't meet that definition, it's not a food. And I think that there are a lot of things we eat that don't meet that definition. Okay, so let's define a food. We'll write this definition up on the board. A food is a substance that forms the material. Make sure you have this in your notes. A food is a substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body Food is a substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of a plant or animal. Or that furnishes energy for it. So that's the definition of a food. And what I want you to focus on is three different things. First, a food is a substance. This will help you to memorize it. Food is a substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of a plant or animal, or that furnishes energy for it. Those are the key terms in that definition. Substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of animals or plants, or that furnishes energy for it. Substance, growth, repair, and energy. So if you get those four ideas in your head, you have the basic skeleton of this definition. It's a substance for growth, repair, and energy. See how you can simplify the definition? It's a substance for growth, repair, and energy of living things. A substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of a plant or animal, or that furnishes energy for it. And notice it says or that furnishes energy for it, because not all foods furnish energy. Not all foods are used for growth or repair. And we'll learn more about that if we study chemistry and physiology later on. Okay, so we have a good definition of a food. A food is a substance that forms the material for the growth or repair of the body of a plant or animal, or that furnishes energy for it. So if you drink a can of Coke, right, it has sugar in it. Sugar is just a carbohydrate. There's nothing wrong with that sugar, but it doesn't serve all of the needs of the body like a healthier drink might. You know, that's why you get yelled at about drinking too much soda, because it's not really healthy. It has something in it. Sugar is okay because it gives your body energy, but it's like a short-term energy. And you could, when you look at the back of a can of soda, how many calories are in a can of soda? You have any idea? You ever look on the back? It's like 200, something like that. I think it might be like 190 or 200. What calories are a unit of measurement for energy. Okay? Basically how much energy the food contains. But all you're getting is sugar. So it's all of this energy, it's all of this food, but it is only of one kind, and it only does so much for the body. And there are healthier alternatives. That's why people fuss about soda or candy. Okay? So let's look at the next section now, which talks about nutrients, because this is what actually makes food healthy for us. We don't just need energy, we also need to nourish the body, because the food also has to provide for growth and repair. That's why you can go out and exercise, you can go run and lift weights and swim and do all these things, but if you're not providing the right kinds of food for your body in the right amounts at the right times, your body won't be able to grow and repair itself. And that's, with weightlifting, growth of your muscles comes from intentionally injuring your muscles actually through weightlifting, and then your body repairing those muscles, and that's how muscle growth takes place. You've got to have the food in your body that allows for that growth and repair to happen, right? So let's look at nutrients down the bottom of page 33. Food substances may be classed into a number of groups, each of which may be detected by means of its chemical composition. So food substances may be classed into a number of groups, each of which may be detected by means of its chemical composition. Such food substances are known as nutrients. Nutrients. Let us examine a few of the nutrients that we are likely to meet with in our daily life and see how we could test chemically to actually know that they're present. So let's learn about some nutrients And then we can learn that there are chemical tests that can be performed, or experiments, where you can actually prove, according to the chemists, that those substances are present in a food. The first is carbohydrates. So I'll just make a short list over here. The first nutrient would be carbohydrates. Chemical substance of which our food is composed. Starch and sugar are examples of this group of substances. Do you know what a starch is? Starch is the substance of pasta, bread, potatoes, things like that. Okay? Starches. Well, corn starch is obviously starch, right? That's why it's called starch. But I'm just saying starch is a substance that's found in potatoes, rice, bread, pasta, and so on. You can think of it as bread to make it simple, okay? Starch and sugar are common examples of carbohydrates. So how can we tell if starch is present in a substance? If the substance to be tested is a solid, break or crush it and add water to it. So if it was a piece of bread or a chunk of potato or something like that, crush it and add water to it. Mix it up with water. Make it pasty in water. Pour over it a few drops of iodine solution diluted with water. Notice the color of the iodine, a dark brown. After it has touched the material supposed to contain starch, note any change in the color. If starch is present, the iodine will turn dark blue. All right? You can get iodine at the drugstore because some people use it to put on cuts, to like sanitize cuts. So if you put some iodine, which is brown, almost like a reddish brown color, onto a substance, and that substance contains starch, the brown color of the iodine will turn to blue, and that you can test for the presence of of starch. Chemists tell us that change in color is caused by the iodine reacting with the starch. Okay? So there's a test for starch. The second nutrient is in our book here called grape sugar. Grape sugar. There are several forms of sugar commonly used as food. So we get sugar from a number of different places. Cane sugar, which is what we think of when we think of white powdered sugar, right? The white sugar we put in coffee or things like that, that's cane sugar. There's also beet sugar, made from beets, and grape sugar. The latter commonly known as glucose. So glucose is a more chemical name for grape sugar. All right? So grape sugar, we'll put in parentheses glucose. You've probably heard that term before. Glucose. Glucose, or grape sugar, is manufactured commercially. Manufactured commercially, that means that food industry manufacturing companies can actually produce grape sugar. And the way that they do it is pouring sulfuric acid over starch. So they use chemistry to actually produce or collect a substance. So by pouring sulfuric acid over starch, they can manufacture glucose. It is used as an adulterant for many kinds of foods, especially in syrups, honey, and candy. So today, you'll notice that the more common sweetener that we find in foods is corn syrup, right? You'll see that all the time, corn syrup. But here, this is talking about grape sugar. So here's a test for the presence of glucose, a glucose test written down it's in the small print in your textbook. The presence of grape sugar is determined by the following test. Place in a test tube or a small jar. Place in a test tube the substance to be tested and heat it in a little water so that the sugar dissolves. Add to that fluid twice its bulk of Felling's solution. That's a chemical a chemist would purchase this at a chemistry supply store. And there's a footnote on it. Add to the fluid twice its bulk of Felling's solution, which has been previously prepared. Heat the mixture, which should now have a blue color in the test tube. If grape sugar is present in considerable quantity, the contents of the tube will turn first a greenish, then a yellow, and finally a brick red color. Smaller amounts will show less decided red. This change also appears if Felling's solution is boiled with cane sugar. A more accurate test is obtained by placing the substance believed to contain grape sugar in a test tube containing Felling's solution and allowing the mixture to remain overnight in a moderately warm room. If grape sugar is present, a red deposit or precipitate, a solid, which is actually copper oxide, will be found in the tube the next morning. All right, so it's possible to test for the presence of grape sugar. And this is the kind of work that chemists do when they analyze substances to figure out what they are. I mean, just imagine if someone gave you a liquid in a cup and said, "Can you tell me what this is?" And you would have no idea how to tell what it is. A chemist could take samples of that substance and begin running tests and could isolate different substances one by one, running all different tests. You understand that? He could test, for example, if there's starch present. He could test if there's glucose present. And he could just keep going through more and more tests to see how things react. If you go to an allergy doctor, the doctor will actually inject you with a bunch of small injections of substances to see how your body reacts to those different substances, and they'll test for your allergies. So chemists use reactions, that's what they call it, reactions, to see how different substances react when other substances or conditions are introduced, because the reactions tell them about what's contained in those substances. The next section, organic fats and oils. Organic fats and oils. Tests for fats. Rub the material believed to contain oil several times on paper and hold the paper up to the light. If oil is present, the paper will show a translucent grease spot. Try this with several different nuts and decide which has the most oil. That's pretty obvious, right? Everybody knows that. If a food has fat and oil in it, it makes paper greasy, right? It also makes your hands greasy. So that's one simple test. A second test for oil is as follows. Heat the substance to be tested in an oven on a piece of paper. If oil is present, the paper will show a grease spot. It's not exactly, high chemistry, but a simple test for fats and oils. Third, reduce the substance to small pieces and pour benzene, ether, or other volatile oil over it. Allow the benzene or ether to evaporate. The oil that remains is the extracted oil from the substance tested. All right, so if you actually wanted to extract the oil, if you wonder, if you look in the closet and see a container full of vegetable oil and you wonder, how in the world did they get that vegetable oil? When we used to feed the dairy cows soybean meal, right? They drew all the soybean oil out of it first. How did they do that? Do you think they squeeze all the soybeans? No, they do it chemically. They can use chemical reactions to cause the oil to separate from the beans. They don't necessarily do it by squeezing the oil out. They can separate it chemically. So there's a third test for how oil could be separated from a substance. Okay? Moving on here. I think we're just about finished with this lesson. Yeah, proteins. So the third was fats and oils. And this actually isn't a second nutrient. This is just another example of carbohydrates. So we had fats and oils, and now lastly proteins. Nitrogenous foods or proteins contain the element nitrogen, in addition to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen of the carbohydrates and hydrocarbons. They include some of the most complex substances known to the chemist, and as we shall see, have a chemical composition very near to that of living matter. Proteins occur in several different forms, but the following tests will cover most cases commonly met. The whites of eggs, lean meat, beans, and peas are examples of substances composed in a large part of protein. So egg whites, lean meat. Why do you think they say lean meat? If you're not eating lean meat, what are you eating? Fats and oils, right? So if you're concerned about protein, eating a big block of hamburger meat that's high in fat is not helping you add protein. You don't need all that fat and oil. If you need protein, what you need, foods like egg whites, lean meats, beans, and peas. Okay? Proteins. They're foods that are high in nitrogen. Here's a test for nitrogen. Test of proteins. Place in a test tube the substance to be tested. For example, a bit of hard-boiled egg. Pour over it a little strong nitric acid. Note the color that appears. It should be a lemon yellow color. Now, wash the egg in water and add a little ammonium hydrate. And these are chemicals that you could buy from a chemical supply store. Wash the egg in water and add a little ammonium hydrate. The color will now change to a deep orange color, showing that a protein is present. So if you want to test to see if a food is high in protein, you could test for it. If the protein is in a liquid state, right, let's say like a glass of milk or a protein shake, right? If the protein is in a liquid state, its presence may be proved by heating. If it coagulates or thickens, as does the white of an egg when it is boiled, then protein in the form of an albumin is present. Just think about it. If you took a cup of oil and put it on the stove in a pan and heated it up until it started to bubble, would it get thick? No, it actually gets thinner, right? When you heat up oil, it gets thinner. If you put a protein into the pan, like an egg white, if it's in a liquid state, and you put it into a pan, heat will cause it to thicken. And that's a sign that a certain type of protein is present. Another protein test easily made at home is by burning the substance. If it burns with the odor of burning feathers or leather, then protein forms part of its composition. So you can tell by the smell that's given off when it burns. I don't know that I know what the smell of burning feathers would smell like, but I could guess what burning leather is like. Okay? So the point is, these substances of which organic bodies, organic parts are made are composed of these three basic substances, these three basic organic substances: carbohydrate, fats and oils, and protein. And there's ways to test for the presence of these things, because remember, this book wants to emphasize that we're not just going to learn information and memorize it and move on and assume it's all true. You can go put this to the test. You can put this to the test and see if it's true. And he's trying to give us some experiments that would allow us to test these things that aren't too complicated. Some of them might be a little difficult because, like I said, you might have to purchase a chemical from a chemical supply store. Or, sometimes they have some of these chemicals at a local farm shop or hardware store or something like that. But there are ways you can test these things if you wanted to. All right? And that brings us to the end of this second lesson, which introduced us to chemistry and physics. And that's it for this class for chemistry and physics, right? All of this talk about chemistry and physics, all of this talk was just to introduce us to some basic ideas in chemistry and physics so that we could get started with our study of biology. We're not going to go further into chemistry and physics. We're going to study them as separate subjects in high school science. But what you should have an idea of, and I think you'll all agree, you know a lot more about chemistry and physics now than you did before you started this chapter, right? You've got ideas in your head you're thinking about. You're thinking about carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen. You're thinking about proteins and carbohydrates and fats and oils. And now that we get into biology, all of a sudden you're going to be looking at all of these living plants and animals and thinking about the chemical composition of their bodies, right? Of the foods that they eat. So that's the purpose of this chapter. It's not to make you a chemist. It's not to make you a physicist. You're not chemists and physicists now. You've just learned a few basic ideas that are enough to help you to be a little more thoughtful as we start studying plants and animals in biology. Okay, that's the purpose of this lesson. So, lesson 2, just to wrap up this lesson in our textbook. Lesson 2 introduced us to some basic ideas in chemistry and physics. You're going to study chemistry and physics as separate courses in high school. We'll get into all these kinds of things in great detail. Time? 42 minutes. All right, so you're going to get into these things in detail in those courses. That's not the purpose of this lesson. What we learned is that all natural things, chemists tell us, are composed of chemical compounds which are composed of chemical elements. Theoretically, and notice they're not saying that you can actually break these things down into their elements. You can't take this chair and break it down into all of its elements and have them all in containers, right? Or then we can rebuild the chair out of the elements. That's not what the chemists are saying. It's a theoretical science that says theoretically all things are composed of elements, chemical elements that exist in the natural world, some that don't exist in the natural world but are artificially made by men. And it's helpful for us as we study the natural world to think about the chemical elements and compounds, the chemical substances that are present in living and non-living things. It helps us to think about what the causes of different effects might be. All right? And we've gone over a number of basic concepts in chemistry and physics in this lesson to give us enough information to get us thinking about these things as we begin the study of biology. All right, so take a minute, write a summary of what we studied in this class, but even more, listen, take a minute to write a summary of what we studied in all of Lesson 2. You have the book in front of you. Take a minute to go back to the beginning of Lesson 2. Go back to the beginning of Lesson 2. Listen to me. Go back to the beginning of Lesson 2 and just flip through the pages. Just flip through the pages and look over the content and write a brief summary of what we talked about as we went through Lesson 2. That's all for this class.